In the early 2010s, Angry Birds was everywhere. They had many multiple different games, toys, and movies generating hundreds of millions of dollars. But by 2019, they were firing masses of staff, and since then, things have only gotten worse. Unlike other popular games Doodle Jump or Fruit Ninja, Angry Birds really stood out because of its unique characters and immersive storyline. It was literally on its way to becoming the next Mario or Sonic. But then the brand completely ruined its own momentum. After years of dedicated fans and success, the company completely diverted into becoming a cheap sellout brand. Horrible sequel games, bad movies, awful attempted products. The brand became a disgrace of what it used to be, and it's probably only a couple years away from its inevitable death. So, how did it get this bad? It all starts in 2009, when a video game company called Rovio was right on the verge of bankruptcy. Over the course of 6 years, they created 50 games, none of which were successful. But then, senior game developer Jaco Islo came to them with this little drawing that he made. It was of these color birds that were super round but has no arms and no legs. And in the drawing, they were being thrown at these stack of blocks. They liked it so much that they decided to make a game revolving around it. And that drawing was the foundation of Angry Birds.
Just some night I was at home and I got the idea of this flock of angry birds like ramming through buildings, and I made a picture out of it, and I showed that to our bosses, and they loved
The game was going to have the birds be thrown at the block structures with a slingshot, but the game needed an enemy. Then Jaco happened to have a picture of these small green pigs that were round and also had no arms and no legs. This idea was due to the swine flu epidemic during that time. The storyline of the game would be that the pigs stole the birds' eggs and that the birds would get revenge on the pigs by throwing themselves at their block. There were 5 main birds: the red bird, the yellow bird, the blue bird, the bomb bird, and the white bird, each of which having their own special abilities. And hence the Angry Birds game was born. The company had enough money to produce one last game before calling it quits. So they were betting everything they had on this one last shot. In April 2009, a game was released named Crush the Castle, which required players to fire a trebuchet into wooden structure hiding many evil people. And after 8 months in December, 2009 game developer Rovio made an app named Angry Birds, which was completely sane. The game had 63 levels and cost 99 cents to download. And at first, the app was a complete flop. For 3 months, barely anybody downloaded it. Rovio realized that they needed to promote the game better, so they were able to get a small banner on the App Store. This was all they needed because eventually the app would go super viral. In just 3 months, it hit #1 in the UK App Store, and a couple months later hit #1 in the US. The game was a hit. It was very unique and silly. Rovio decided to drop every single other project that they were working on and solely focus on Angry Birds. They saw the potential to possibly become one of the biggest gaming companies in the world, and soon enough, they would do that. App Store games was still a pretty new thing. They were doing everything they possibly can to take this to the top. They started with small improvements on the game, like better sound effects and having a soundtrack. But to expand the game was going to take a little bit more than that. They decided to add new levels frequently to the game. Every couple of months, they would drop a new set of levels through updates, each of them having a different theme and being slightly more challenging. This was a solid way to keep users engaged and cost no extra money. They would also add new characters like how the Boomerang Bird or Big Terrence, the Big Red Bird. The first time Rovio ever added in-app purchase was the Mighty Eagle. It was essentially an option to beat a very hard level. It was a slight cash grab, but it still introduced a new character in a very creative and unique way. The Mighty Eagle was this very mysterious, cool character, and essentially was a way to beat those levels that were just too hard. With all success, they decided to drop another Angry Birds game a year later called Angry Birds Seasons. It was essentially a holiday-themed version of Angry Birds, and they would drop new levels around the holiday season. By the end of 2010, Angry Birds had over 50 million downloads. At this point, Rovio knew that it was going to be future. 2011 was the year that Rovio did anything. They can put Angry Birds everywhere. They acquired $42 million investment from a capital firm to really expand on the brand. They dropped a version of Angry Birds onto Facebook, which took them years to make, which was a real movie-themed version of the game that was going to help promote movie and also promote Angry Birds. This was a big deal for the company because it was their first collaboration with a major film company. It got over 10 million downloads in its first 9 months, and they also still continued to regularly update Angry Birds. By the end of 2011, the game got over 500 million downloads. Rovio made 10 times the amount of money they made the last year, and their staff grew from 20 to over 220. And soon they would drop their next game, Angry Birds Space, which had all these crazy space scenes, and this game got a ton of hype and quite literally was the fastest growing app ever, getting over 50 million downloads in 35 days. That same year, they even dropped a Star Wars version of the game, which was also a huge hit. The games were just getting better and better, but it wasn't just on mobile phones. They wanted to go beyond that. They dropped a version of Angry Birds on the PlayStation device and on the PS3. The game was doing phenomenal numbers, but Rovio saw an opportunity to make money that was outside of games. Merch was the real money machine when it came to Angry Birds. On their website, they sold tons of clothing and accessories, but the real seller was the plush toys. These were in toy stores everywhere. All kids wants them. The merch alone counted for 45% of all the sales that they were making. Fans loved the game and loved buying the merch. And for Rovio, it was especially a huge win because they officially reached over 1 billion download in May 2012. And just 3 years from the game initially launching, they now became an unforgettable influence worldwide. Everyone was aware and addicted to this game. News media companies were talking about it. TV hosts were talking about it. Celebrities like Kevin Durant and Justin Bieber were talking about it. By 2013, Angry Birds was unstoppable. But in the beginning of 2014, Angry Birds have reached over 2 billion downloads. But at the same time, Angry Birds was exposed as being a leaky app, as apparently it was collecting personal data like sexual orientation and location. And they were given this data to the NSA and NCHQ. The person who made this accusation was Edward Snowden. Rovio denied that they were giving any of this information away, but did admit that their advertisers might be doing so. It got to the point where the app was actually quite literally hacked, where the name was defaced to say Spying Birds. But this was the least of their worries because as a whole in 2014, Rovio's profits severely decreased. That year their revenue dropped by 73% because their game was getting a little tiring. It was a solid game, but when you really think about it, it was same thing over and over again which were making people tired of it. Rovio was getting desperate and they realized that somehow they were going to have to innovate their game. Otherwise they were done for. Now, initially they did try different games that were different styles from the Angry Birds formula. They dropped Bad Piggies, which was a game completely revolved around the pigs, where you design these contraptions to get them to the finish line. It was a genius and very creative game that did pretty well. They dropped Angry Birds Go, which was essentially a racing game around the Angry Birds characters. They dropped the game Angry Birds Epic, which did 50 million downloads its first year. Then they dropped Angry Birds Stella, which was completely dedicated to the Stella character, and this got 30 million downloads its first year. Then they dropped Angry Birds Transformers, which was the sliding shooter game. There was some slight decrease in popularity, but overall the games were still doing lots of numbers, and people were still playing with them. And the merch sales went down by 43%, which is pretty bad. Even though they were still updating the apps, dropping new games, and even opening Angry Birds theme parks, the sales were still going down. And the merch did take up half of the profits. Rovio had to fire 110 of its employees because the drop was just that bad. It was so bad that the original CEO of Rovio since 2009 stepped down that year. Rovio realized to somehow make as much as money of the Angry Birds franchise as possible to save the company and the brand. The desperation of Angry Birds company started to show in 2015 with the drop of some very odd games. They dropped Angry Birds Pop, which was like this very weird Candy Crush ripoff. The game only got 10 million downloads its first year. They dropped Angry Birds Fight, which was this player v player game, but also only got like 10 million downloads its first year. Then they straight up dropped Angry Birds 2, which was sequel to the original. Overall, the games did okay, and Rovio did reach 3 billion downloads that year, but there was a much more noticeable decline from the previous years. The problem with these games that there wasn't really being that much added to the storyline or the characters as a whole, so the Rovio eventually had to fire 260 of their employees. The original creator of Angry Birds left that year, and the new CEO that took place also left after only 1 year. The company was just becoming a complete whole. Rovio's latest attempt to try Angry Birds series would be through an attempt that no one has ever really thought of before. Now, when the game launched, Angry Birds was pretty active on their YouTube channel, but as the time went on, they started to post more high-quality animated shorts on there, and they would even post the trailers for the new video game coming. And these videos would get tens of million views, with some of them getting over 100 million. In 2011, they even had their own Christmas special briefly on Nickelodeon. And with the growth of brand, they started to post more and more of these type of videos, eventually creating their own web series called Angry Birds Toons. Now these videos are literally only a couple second long long and posted weekly. But as it got more popular, they created more and more spin-offs, posting much more frequently on the channel. And they eventually got over 7 million subscribers. But even though this show was successful and their games were doing well, it didn't really transition that well to merch sales in the long run over the years. So Rovio decided to make a huge investment to hopefully revive the brand, and that was through the Angry Birds movie. Now, this movie was in the works for several years, ever since 2012. They always envisioned making a movie, but when they were laying off all their employees, the only departments that were spared were the ones who were working on this movie. So they were betting it all on this film. They had a budget $80 million for the production, and they quite literally made their own animation studio for it. To promote movie, they did a bunch of collaborations like with McDonald's, Ziploc, Panasonic. They even dropped a whole line of Lego sets. Rovio was essentially putting all of their chips into this round, and when the movie dropped in 2016, it actually did pay off. It hit over $350 million across the box offices, which gave them a $72 million profit. It was the 6th highest grossing video game movie ever, and possibly the highest grossing movie ever made from Finland. And Angry Birds theme parks popped up in different countries. Media outlets reported Rovio Games had its best year ever in 2016. However, the gaming releases that Angry Birds was known for was still declining in quality. In this video, I played and ranked every Angry Birds game so you don't have to. Jake Miller talks about Angry Birds Action was the start of using the new anthropomorphic designs from movies in their games, which I think most fans agree was the real beginning of the end for the series, which happened to be the first game after the movie, and Angry Birds 2's revenue growing 47% in 2018, despite being over 3 years old. This gave them the budget to make a second movie. However, their $65 million bets didn't pay off. Forbes write Angry Birds 2 is worse than the original in nearly every way. Despite their older games being low maintenance, Rovio decided to completely stop updating them. Then, without explanation, some of the older beloved titles, including the original Angry Birds, were deleted from the App Store when people began to talk about what they had done. People made compilations stating Angry Birds was dead. On Twitter, #BringBack2012 began to trend. Things got so bad that Rovio apologized, stating they only did it as maintaining the highest quality of updates and live operations isn't possible with our older games. In response to the backlash that announced they planned on redeveloping Angry Birds Classic, which was re-released on the App Store in 2022, but at a price of $1.99 with no in-game purchases, they changed Classic's name to Red's First Flights, making it harder to find in the App Store, thus prompting players to buy the newer, more profitable game. Successfully fooled some people who to find it on the App Store. However, others knew exactly what Angry Birds was doing. They got rid of the old ones so that you would have no other choice than to play the modern Candy Crush games. They despised the games that made the company and so lost its spirit. Rovio basically confirmed this openly, stating, "They changed the name due to the game's impact on our wider games portfolio. They further requested that fans continue to bring that passion to our live Angry Birds slingshot games, such as Angry Birds 2. However, players weren't too happy. We hope those fans can continue to bring that passion to our other games, which have been designed to be more psychologically manipulative and stuffed with more microtransactions. The drama was so severe it seemingly halted any future games, as Angry Birds Classic is still the most recent title released way back in 2021-22. In 2023, Rovio was sold to Sega. Although this has done little to fix their reputation,